Rain slicked the roof tiles and the olive leaves wept. A jeep idled under blackout hoods, engine ticking like a metronome in the cold. 2 hours before dawn, 3rd December 1944, technician 4th grade George McKenny wiped his hands on a towel that smelled of carbolic and canvas. A runner from the outpost had found him, Italian civilian in labour, husband taken by the Germans weeks ago, farmhouse halfway to the ridge. The German observation post sat less than a mile uphill, a dark knuckle in the mist. He slid onto the jeep's passenger seat, water beading on his steel helmet. The driver feathered the clutch and the little Willys MB crabbed through ruts as though it had a sixth sense for mud. The farmhouse door opened on a square of lamplight. Inside, a scrubbed table, boiled sheets, a mother's breath gone ragged. The grandmother crossed herself and handed McKenny a chipped basin. "American?" she asked, as if the word itself might change the outcome. He nodded once and set the bag down. Field manuals lived in his muscle memory now, FM and TM 8 series, the ladder from aid station to collecting station to ambulance to evacuation hospital. But doctrine could not lower the baby's head or soften the contractions that came like surf. He cleaned, he coached, he measured out morphine in a dose that would dull pain without clouding the mother's will. Outside, the jeep idled, a promise. Down Valley, a WC-54 ambulance had already been flagged and would be climbing, 4 litres or 6 seated, canvas breathing with every bump. A distant 81mm coughed somewhere beyond the river. No reply. The front was close, but it did not enter this room. McKenny's hands worked with a calm he had learned on men who bled and shook. Now he went slower, voice low, eyes on the second hand of a wristwatch that had outlived 3 straps. The head crowned, the scream peaked, and for one heartbeat every sound faded but the patter of rain. Then a new cry cut the kitchen, high and furious and alive. He grinned despite himself. "Little out of my line," he said softly, and the grandmother laughed through tears. He wrapped the infant in a GI blanket that smelled of wool and iodine and held him to the mother's chest. The runner tugged his cap against the weather and stepped back. The jeep's engine note deepened outside, impatient to finish the chain it had begun. The grandmother kissed the child's brow and whispered a name she had not dared to say until life proved stronger than fear. In the valley, a map waited under a smeared acetate, pencil poised to sketch a line that did not run toward the ridge, but toward a ward light. Engines low, men ready, the ladder would extend another rung the moment McKenny lifted his head and said, "Move!" By mid-morning, the rain came slantwise in sheets that turned the Serchio Valley Road to grey grease. At Battalion, a grease pencil traced the Versilia sector across acetate, a curved inheritance named the Gothic Line. The Buffalo's companies held the river bottoms and the terraced hills. Patrols were already out, buttons of damp wool glinting under capes. A chaplain scrounged charcoal and blankets for a schoolhouse-turned-aid station. Civil affairs bargained for kerosene and a donkey cart. War here sounded like wet boots, quiet radios, and the cough of an engine choosing first gear. Orders moved the way they always did. Voice clipped to save the batteries, runners trotting when the net went dead, jeep couriers throwing rooster tails of mud. The call about the labouring woman rode the same arteries as a request for mortar rounds. It was not sentiment, it was policy and practice. Secure your rear, steady the villages, make the roads yours. The medical detachment slid into its routine as if on rails. Aid station, collecting station, evacuation, ladder rungs that fit any terrain you could bleed on. The WC-54 came up the switchbacks with its canvas sides breathing, hooded lights cutting ovals from the mist. Its litter racks were simple and sure, braces that welcomed the weight of bodies in shock and pain without fanfare. Inside the barn-turned-aid room, a corporal cleaned suction equipment while a private boiled instruments in a battered field sterilizer that hissed like an angry cat. A nurse from the evacuation hospital arrived with an interpreter, both faces chapped by wind. "We'll do a quick check and move," she said. Down the valley, a generator governor would close, plasma would be hung, and a surgeon would glance once at a chart before making the cut that saved a life. Along the map edge, a supply sergeant ran his finger from the port to the drop points and back, counting trucks by habit. GMC CCK 2.5s carried what the line could not live without: rations, blankets, gasoline in 5-gallon jerry cans, boxes stamped MED and SURG. His notebook held the usual decisions: who gets tyres, who waits, which platoon trades a good driver for a better engine. He had learned to think in columns of tonnage and hours, in maintenance echelons and cannibalized parts that put one more vehicle on the road. Out on the farmhouse track, the ambulance braked, shoes slipping in the mud as litter bearers took their places. McKenny stepped into the doorway, a GI blanket in his arms, the child bawling like a bugle before first light. The mother's face shone with sweat and relief. "Ready to move," he said to the nurse. The convoy of care extended itself another mile, and the battalion map acquired a new pencil line that ran not toward the enemy, but toward a ward, a generator, and a medicine modern enough to feel like science fiction. The jeep fell in behind, the litter straps creaked, and the road, claimed now by logistics and mercy, bent toward the valley. Sergeant Carl Weiss watched through fog-blurred lenses as the switchback swallowed and returned American silhouettes. He had counted trucks since Salerno, notches in a notebook, morning columns, evening returns, the way the Yankees' traffic thickened even when their fire thinned. He told his corporal that it was waste. He told himself that a disciplined army economized movement, that doctrine ought to be neat, but the neatness never came. Even here, with rain skimming the ridgelines and mule trails mucky enough to swallow a boot, the road below kept producing vehicles, as if from a spring no ration could cap. He lifted the glasses again. A jeep nosed around a bend, then a 3/4 ton with a canvas tilt, then a Dodge WC-54 with the patient, steady gait of a hospital that had sprouted wheels. Hooded headlights winked once as the ambulance halted by a farmhouse halfway up the slope. "For wounded?" the corporal asked. Weiss couldn't quite say. He had learned not to underestimate American trickery, but the body language was wrong for violence. Men stood easy. One went in unarmed, sleeves rolled. From the chimney, a curl of smoke licked the rain. He had been taught to watch for guns and radios. He watched now for something else and didn't like what he saw. The Americans brought not just steel, but mattresses and blankets and a calm that infected streets like a placard. In the winter of 1944, their industry seemed to bend physics. The corporal muttered a number he'd heard from a prisoner, and Weiss wrote it anyway to shame it later. 2.4 million trucks bought by the US Army since 1939. 2.4 million, enough that a single theatre could lose a convoy to mud and still not feel thin. He tried a different math. How many tyres did one nation have to make to keep that river of wheels from clotting? How much gasoline to keep even the ambulances at idle while officers talked? He remembered Italy's ration cards and the RSI depot with its rows of emptiness, requisition forms filed like prayers. The ambulance eased away from the farmhouse with a softness he envied, its canvas sides puffing as it took the grade. Hooded light faded. The corporal spat rain and said, "Sir, shall I log?" Weiss closed the notebook and said only, "We counted wrong." In his head, the old arithmetic still urged him to tally calibers and barrels, but the Ridge Road had become a proof he could not ignore. Engines, not slogans, were winning here, and the Americans had more engines than he had fingers to count with. The fog swallowed the tail lights and gave nothing back but the smell of fuel. The kitchen smelled of boiled linen and wool, the kind of clean that stung the sinuses and made your eyes water. Lucia's mother held the lamp while McKenny knelt and checked again. Bleeding minimal, respiration strong, infant pink and loud. He showed the grandmother how to keep the airway clear, how to count breaths against the whisper of the rain, how to rub the tiny back if the rhythm slipped. The jeep outside ticked like a watch. From farther down the slope came the deeper, patient rhythm of the WC-54 climbing, gears shouldering the grade. When the ambulance door clapped open, warm air rolled out, smelling faintly of oil, canvas and talc. The litter racks were ready. The straps had that particular waxed feel, neither rough nor slick. The driver had the look of a man who kept a vehicle alive with his ears, head cocked, hand on the dash when the engine idled, foot already thinking about the turn. An interpreter explained that mother and infant would likely stop at a collecting station for vitals, then ride to the evacuation hospital. "It will be routine," the nurse said, and somehow that word slowed everyone's breathing. Routine here meant power arranged in advance. Penicillin would have been the next word in the chain, a modern magic that the American ward had to hand by late 1944. Not a promise, not a miracle, but a better chance than the village midwife could give. In the field sterilizer, a batch of instruments clicked as they cooled. McKenny cleaned his hands with a sting of iodine and wrote a quick note. Time of birth, colour, mother's vitals, a line for the surgeon that read simply, "No complications observed." The nurse smiled with the brisk assurance that comes only when repetition meets training. Outside, the ambulance sank slightly on its springs as the weight came aboard. The driver checked hooded lights, tapped the fuel gauge, and glanced at his clipboard where maintenance hours were brutally neat. Oil changes, grease points ticked off in pencil. Somewhere beyond the next ridge, an aid station would be clearing room, a generator closing its governor as another ward heater went on. A chain is only as strong as its weakest link. This one had been forged in parts lists and training tables until the weak links were hard to find. They rolled in second gear, engine humming. Lucia watched the olive trees slide by and thought of her husband being marched north, of a name they had not yet chosen. She held the baby close and felt the strangeness of safety in enemy hands, the warmth of a wool blanket that did not smell like home but did smell like survival. Behind them, the farmhouse settled into quiet. Ahead, the road curved toward a place she had never seen and would never forget. The rain softened. Somewhere, a church bell tried the hour, uncertain at first, then certain enough to be heard over the engine. Down valley, canvas buildings had learned to breathe. The evacuation hospital sat like a temporary town, guy lines taut, stakes seated in gravel that held the rain better than clay. Lieutenant Colonel Manuel Lichtenstein stood under a blackout hood and listened to his ward the way a farmer listens to a barn. The hum of a generator, the tick of a sterilizer, the steady murmur of nurses reciting vitals into the records. He had said it enough times that his team could mouth it with him. I stitch them up and God heals them. He checked the receiving tent first. 2 litter teams warmed their hands around a stove improvised from a steel drum. Plasma units lay in a crate like pale lanterns. An X-ray tech threaded film and made the small adjustments that kept a machine worth more than his family's house purring in the damp. The hospital had been here before. It could tear down and move in a day if the line required it. A caravan that knew its own weight and balance. Routine was not laziness here. Routine was a weapon. The quartermaster sergeant brought in the daily wants and haves, a ritual that mattered as much as any morning report. Gauze, catgut, morphine, penicillin, the last packed in a way that made the pharmacist smile, because for once nothing had spoiled. The sergeant had been a truck driver at home, and now thought in ton miles and axle loads, in what a GMC CCKW could carry before rubber, not courage, became the limiting factor. He had learned to stage loads so that a ward could get hotter as a weather front got colder, to move blankets with the barometer. When the ambulance's horn chirped twice, the receiving nurse flicked a glance at the clock. Right on schedule. A litter came out with a mother whose face had that exhausted peace that follows ordeal. The infant's cry was smaller now, more question than demand. The interpreter bent close and explained what would happen. The words had grooves worn into them already. Liechtenstein met the mother's eyes and nodded as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world, and here it was. A country that could spend bullets without flinching could also spend gauze, heat, and hours on a stranger. Later, when the ward settled into the slow rhythm of afternoon, the surgeon stood under the hood of a CCKW and listened to a mechanic diagnose a cough in the carburetor by ear. The man had black fingernails and the patience of a watchmaker. He tightened a clamp, wiped the wrench, and the idle smoothed. Liechtenstein thought again how a hospital that moves is still a hospital, and how the miracle is not mystery but repetition married to power. In the distance, beyond the trees, engines droned like a congregation at prayer, and the day's ledger clicked one more entry toward Hull. At dawn, the road laid out its argument in metal. Jeep, 3/4 ton, ambulance, deuce and a half, links in a chain that kept its own time. A convoy snaked along the ridge where yesterday there had been ruts and hesitation. Today there was cadence. The scale revealed itself not in a single grand gesture, but in the refusal to falter. McKenny rode in back to return the borrowed blanket, the wool still warm from a night under ward lights. From the high curve he could see the valley breathe, roofs steaming, fields lifting mist, the black thread of the Circio looking newly stitched. Numbers have a sound when they're honest. The Americans had bought on the order of 2.4 million trucks since 1939, an inventory so vast that a theatre as rugged as Italy could waste a movement and never notice. They had produced roughly 647,000 jeeps, little machines that took a field manual and turned it into motion over mud and stone. They had built about 26,000 Dodge WC-54 ambulances and then treated them not as rare birds, but as tools to be used until the paint wore thin. Those figures feel impossible until you hear them idling together, a choir of cylinders singing the same note. Weiss, on the opposite ridge, tried again to translate wheels into outcomes. If you could move a mother and a battalion by the same road, what could not be moved? He remembered an RSI depot where men had argued over 10 tyres and a single crate of spark plugs, as if dividing an inheritance. He watched a US motor pool swap a carburetor like a man changing his mind. He reached for an old consolation that Americans were soft, and found it useless. Soft armies do not bring X-ray machines to goat paths. The convoy slowed at a washout, and then rolled through because the engineers had come in the night, because trucks carried shovels and picks with the same respect they carried rifles, because when doctrine met, mud doctrine also brought diesel. The quartermaster's clerk in the lead truck checked his clipboard, stifled a yawn, and noted that fuel points up valley would extend hours if the weather held. Routine again, the quiet audacity of showing up on time. By the farm where the baby had been born, the grandmother came to the doorway and crossed herself at the sight of a moving hospital disguised as traffic. She would remember years later, not the colour of uniforms, but the sound of engines that never ran dry. The convoy passed, hoods hooded, lights hooded, and left behind the smell of gasoline, a promise that the road would be passable tomorrow and the day after. Somewhere a rooster tried the morning on and decided to keep it, and McKenny, tucking the blanket tighter under his arm, prepared without fanfare for whatever the day would require next. Gratitude travels faster than orders. In the week after the birth, the valley began to speak to the buffalo's patrols in a new tone, half shy, half conspiratorial. A boy with mud-cuffed trousers traded a square of chocolate for the certainty that 2 German machine guns had moved to a chestnut grove above the mule path. An old mason, stiff with rheumatism, traced a switchback shortcut in the dirt with his cane and tapped twice where a culvert had rotted. Civil Affairs logged the names without fanfare, then sent a jeep to confirm. The engine's note rose and fell as if sniffing for truth. McKenny found himself back on perimeter duty with a field phone pressed to a wet stone wall, listening to a line that hissed like frying lard. Every so often the handset went dead and the runner would lope out, come back with a grin and a twist of spliced wire. The road was learning their names, A driver could say, "the Smithy Corner," and a map would form in 3 heads at once. At the schoolhouse aid station, the nurse from the evacuation hospital returned with a bundle of donated linen and a tin of coffee that transformed the air. She told Lucia that the infant's weight was holding, that the colour was good, that a ward heater would keep the nights kind. Lucia's mother nodded, eyes on the floorboards, and said in a voice that could have been prayer or politics, "They are not like the last ones." The last ones had taken men north and left promises behind like empty crates. The Americans left blankets and rations stamped US and a schedule that kept its appointments. Far up the slope, Weiss watched the same quiet commerce and felt a pressure he could not name. It wasn't a raid, it wasn't propaganda. It was the way a road bends to the wheels that use it most. He had drilled on ambushes and angles of fire. He had not drilled on mercy as a force multiplier. The Buffalo's S3 penciled new arrows on the acetate, little arcs that acknowledged a footpath discovered because a baby had been born in the wrong month of the wrong war. On a fog-slick evening, McKenny rode courier with a bundle of field dressings cradled like a kitten and the faint sour reek of wet wool in his nostrils. The Jeep's windshield wipers squeaked in a rhythm his bones accepted as normal now. When they passed the farmhouse where the boy had breathed his first, the grandmother waved with both hands and shouted a name that made the driver grin. "George's baby," he said, and downshifted for the bend. The night smelled of wood smoke and diesel, and the valley, having watched a hospital come to its door, began to keep secrets for the side that kept its promises. On the morning after Christmas, the rain changed its voice and came knifing sideways with pellets that stung cheeks and made helmets ring. The net woke mean. Contact reports stacked, terse and breathless. Pressure north of Baga, machine guns in the olive trees, mortars walking the terraces like blind men tapping canes. The Buffalo bent where the ground left no room to be brave. A platoon that had owned a wall at dawn found itself downstream by noon, counting heads and swearing at maps that had never admitted how steep this place could get when a man was tired and wet. McKenny's litter team ran the soggy zigzags with boots that squished, sets of hands becoming a single set by repetition. At the collecting station, a corporal readied smoke pots and a lantern with its hood down to a slit. Hooded headlights made pools of smeared light that moved exactly as far as they were told, and not 1 inch farther. The WC-54s came hunched and patient, gearboxes muttering. They took their loads and wheeled like farm horses that knew every route underfoot. On the ridge, Weiss felt the exultation that always rides the first bite of a counterstroke. The line moved, he could see that much. He could also see the glint of stretchers and the ant-like economy with which the Americans managed retreat. They did not sprawl, they articulated. Aid stations leapfrogged in a drill that made no fuss about its cleverness. When a road failed, the engineers slid to the front of the deck without ceremony. When a truck hesitated, another nudged it through. Numbers would be written later, killed, missing, captured. But on this day the arithmetic showed in engines that would not die, and men who knew their jobs down to the angle a hood should open in sleet. A runner ducked into McKenny's alcove and blurted over the whip of rain that a section had been cut off near a stand of cypresses. The medic took a quick count of dressings and syrettes and nodded because even bad news sits easier when you have counted. He stepped back into the weather and felt the stove's heat fall off his skin as if a door had closed. The ambulance driver looked at him once, caught the message, and downshifted into a crawl that would save springs and spines. On Weiss's hill, the corporal said the thing you say when a counter-attack hits its second day and the map looks good. "Sir, perhaps this time—" Weiss silenced him with a hand because the traffic below had not thinned. It had thickened, but in rescue. By nightfall the fog smelled of cordite and wet wool, and somewhere in that complicated dark a convoy's tail lights slid through a notch in the ridge and did not stop until the ward door swallowed them. Night stitched itself to the road with red cat's eyes that blinked and moved. The ambulance engines settled into a low hymn. The deuce and a halfs answered with a steadier bass. Somewhere up front, a jeep insisted on the beat. McKenny rode backward on a bench with a hand on a sergeant's shoulder, counting respirations, letting the engine's vibration do half the work of keeping a man awake. When the litter straps creaked, the driver eased the angle. When the heater coughed, he thumped the housing with the heel of his hand, and it obeyed. The ward drew them in by habit. Plasma hung, penicillin syringes gleamed like blunt silver reeds. A mechanic with black crescents under his nails slid a fresh fan belt over the generator pulley, turned the key, and listened for the purr that meant a convoy would leave on schedule again. The system absorbed punishment by design. Maintenance echelons, organizational, intermediate, depot, caught failures like nets under a trapeze. If a truck lost a carburetor, a driver swapped it in minutes because bolt patterns matched by decree, not luck. If an ambulance cracked a spring, another took the load while a box from the next town over yielded the part. Up on the ridge, Weiss tried to order an ambush to bite at the tail, but found the tail replaced itself. He had mocked American waste in his heart for 2 years. Now he watched redundancy earn its commission. On a lull, a quartermaster clerk told a young driver an absurd truth that felt like blasphemy and comfort at once. Back home at Willow Run in Michigan, one plant had reached a rhythm of a B-24 bomber every hour. One airplane, 60 short minutes, and another, day after day. More heavy machines each sunrise than some nations could imagine in a month. The driver whistled once and tightened his grip on the wheel. Impossible, Weiss would have said last year. Tonight it sounded like the hum in his teeth as a column went by, too close for sleep. The ambulance door banged. McKenny leaned in to adjust a blanket around a man who would live because heat arrived on time. On the wall, someone had chalked a schedule that would be kept unless the earth itself rolled over. The storm softened to a murmur. In the space between coughs and orders, a nurse touched a cuff to Lucia's wrist as she waited with the baby for a follow-up, and both readings made sense. Engines faded and returned like waves on a stony shore, and the night, fed with fuel and parts and discipline, refused to end badly. After the counterstroke burned down to coals, the valley resumed its winter breathing, roofs steaming in brief sun, stones sweating when wind turned. A clerk set a ledger next to a captured German map and found, to his surprise, that they spoke the same language, columns and arrows, causes and effects. He totaled tonnage, moved and fuel issued, litters hauled and hours logged with the grim tenderness of a man counting scars. Liechtenstein read ward reports that showed penicillin doing in hours what prayer had once governed in days. The Buffalo's S3 measured vehicle density along the line, how many wheels per mile, how many drivers with enough sleep to keep them true, and understood that a mile with enough rubber on it is shorter than one with none at all. These were not glamorous tallies. They were the sound of victory when no band played. Weiss, on the ridge that had lost its teeth, made his own accounting. He wrote that the Americans had broken contact with an infuriating neatness and then returned in an even neater column of recovery. He added that he had seen ambulances pause for civilians again, and that the pause had cost them nothing he could measure in ground. He did not write what he felt when he watched a nurse carry a blanket through sleet like a flag. McKenny inventoried the aid station with the same attention he gave a hemorrhage. Dressings counted, morphine syrettes tallied, sulfur confirmed. Routine brought the pulse down. He walked outside into a light so thin it made the hills look brittle and found the ambulance driver under the hood of the WC-54 caressing a plug wire. The engine coughed, considered and purred. "Good girl," the driver said, and closed the hood with a palm as gentle as you'd use on a horse. The valley would keep this day not because anyone climbed a clock tower to declare it saved, but because the road to the hospital stayed passable and the schedule held. Numbers spoke in a register too low for parades. Shipments met, throughput maintained, litres warmed, babies weighed, wounded, stabilised, and moved. The ledger closed for the night with a weight that felt like certainty. Weiss, returning to his dugout, touched his notebook and did not open it. He had run out of arithmetic that made him brave. He lay down and listened to an engine somewhere below turn over, catch, and settle into a rhythm that promised tomorrow would arrive whether he wanted it or not. By March, the hills softened and the war, while not done, learned to step lighter along the Vasilia roads. The olive trees glimmered with new leaves that looked like the inside of coins. The farmhouse doorframes dried enough to stop sweating. Lucia walked the lane with the baby bundled against her chest and a cautious pride that made her taller. She passed a grader chewing the winter's ruts into obedience and waved at the driver who had learned to smile with his whole face. The jeep that rattled by wore demobilization papers on its clipboard like a bird with a letter tied to its leg. "Soon," the driver told McKenny, and they both pretended the word had only one meaning. At the church, the priest, who had blessed both funerals and fuel cans, christened the boy Giorgio and let the name sit in the nave like a new tile waiting for grout. The grandmother wept and handed the nurse a cut-glass bowl that had survived 2 regimes and a requisition without a chip. Civil affairs closed out ledgers that glowed with small victories. Bridges shored, clinics stocked, mines flagged with warning triangles that fluttered like a field of poppies no one dared pick. Liechtenstein doled out his last hoarded coffee to the ward and told the X-ray tech that he would miss the hum that had become the hospital's heartbeat. In a corner locker, Lucia kept an empty morphine syrette as if it were a relic. When she pressed it between finger and thumb, she could feel the moment the pain had yielded an inch. Weiss, furloughed to a rear billet that smelled of damp straw and defeat, wrote nothing for days, and then a page that surprised even him. He said that the enemy had shown a kind of wealth he did not have a word for, the kind that makes schedules keep themselves and strangers safe. He did not show the page to anyone. He folded it and tucked it into a pocket where the fabric had already learned the shape of regret. On a clear morning, McKenny walked the road past the farmhouse and paused when the grandmother called from the doorway. She held up the boy like a loaf pulled from the oven and said the name with a laugh that had outlived the winter. The medic touched the child's cheek with the back of his knuckles, the way you do when you are afraid to leave a fingerprint on something perfect. Down the road, the WC-54 idled with a note that had become part of the valley's music. The day smelled of dust and warm oil, and the promise that all machines make when they are cleaned, fueled, and pointed toward home. Years later, a museum hall held the quiet of an emptied church. Under the lights, a WC-54 gleamed as if it had just been wiped down after a long night, canvas tight, fenders smooth enough to mirror a boy's face. Giorgio, now grey at the temples, a hand as square as his grandfather's, stood with his daughter and read the caption about a birth near the Gothic line. The words were modest, the metal behind them not. He remembered the sound first, an engine at idle with the patience of a nurse. The docent, a veteran with a voice scuffed by cigarettes and peace, explained how scale can be moral. He spoke of standardization as if reciting a creed, bolt patterns, training tables, manuals that taught a farm boy to become an aidman fast enough to matter. He pointed to numbers that still looked boastful, even when spoken softly. Roughly 2.4 million trucks procured by the US Army, about 647,000 jeeps, around 26,000 ambulances like the one in front of them, multiplied until villages felt rich in moments that had no business feeling safe. Then he widened the lens to the fact that always pulls a breath. By 1944, one plant at Willow Run had learned to deliver a complete B-24 Liberator every hour on the hour, a ritual of wings and rivets that turned calendar time into machinery. An hour for an airplane, another hour for another. What tyrannies tried to seize with terror, a republic made by schedule. Giorgio touched the fender with 2 fingers and thought of rain on tile, the iodine sting, the wool smell of a blanket that had not been his and therefore saved him. He thought of engines as ethics, a system so large and well taught it could spare mercy without losing momentum. The docent nodded toward a case of field manuals, FM and TM8 series, and said that victory at scale is just repetition with conscience. Weiss's notebook, donated years after the man's name had turned sepia, lay open under glass on a page that admitted a hard thing in a tight hand. We counted wrong. Somewhere beyond the museum's brick walls, a delivery truck downshifted on a hill, and the sound came in faintly, familiar as a lullaby. Giorgio told his daughter that the ambulance had not brought a miracle, only a schedule kept by men who believed that keeping it mattered. She squeezed his arm, and they stood until the hall's lights dimmed. On leaving, he glanced back once and saw the vehicle as it must have looked that winter, hooded, purposeful, ready to move when a medic lifted his head and said, "Go." The lesson followed them out into the American air,